thanks so much for, mode. I know it's creating a lot of reverberation at my end, so I hear the echo of my voice coming back. I hope you don't hear your own echo. Perhaps if mute is turned off on your end. No, that won't work, will it? Yeah, good, great. Okay, super. Thank you. Yeah, so I know it's very difficult listening to Skype, or in this case Zoom presentations, and to add to that difficulty, I'm going to read the text because this will assist in the work of translation. But I really do wish I was there in a lot of ways. I used to be commuting through Hangzhou on the way to Ningbo from Shanghai on a regular basis, and indeed I was sitting in exactly the room that you are currently sitting in around this time in August 2008. So I would have loved to have been there for this reason, and to be with you to hear these discussions. Fortunately, I'm not able to make it. So, my special thanks to the organizers and the audience, you, for accommodating this. It's interesting, I'm sure you've had a lot of discussion around this. Now, of course, this year is the 50th anniversary of Lefebvre's Right to the City and his critique of planetary urbanism. Andy Merrifield, I know, wrote a pretty interesting introduction to the Verso publication of texts, which you can download from the Verso site. But today, I wanted to address the emergence of a city form coincident with societies of automation. And in the spirit of Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, in the background to this paper is an interest in the relation between temporal repetition of machines and the non-linear time of daily routines of life. And there's also what I hope is a clear interest in the political and even ontological problem of what Andy Merrifield calls in his introduction to the essays on the right to the city, workers without any real stake in the future of work. And I think the introduction to this panel captured that in other ways on another scale extremely well. It's entirely correct that that's to say, commentators and critics writing from the kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic perspective of Silicon Valley need a serious reorientation if they were to kind of begin to comprehend the reconfiguration of geopolitical power through the kind of prism of what Nick Schoeneck, which I'll talk about a bit more in this talk, has gone on to call platform capitalism. I'd also just quickly note that the lovely poster that's been designed for this conference has a different title for my presentation. My apologies for that. But the paper on that poster can be found in the recently launched open access journal called Media Theory, quite simply. So I'll now proceed with this text. It'll be about 20 minutes or so. I hope that's okay. And I'll intersperse it a bit with some images. So there'll be a bit of sort of flicking for me between screens, and hopefully it's seamless enough for you. All right, the micro-political momentum of 1968 has been exhausted. Instead of attending the wedding of the cybernetic avant-garde with hippie modernism, society at large decided to celebrate a technological solutionism whose sole aim is to capture and contain the contingency of expression. Uncertainty is circumscribed by risk analysis. Prediction has been accorded the status of a core cultural technique. Taste is relegated to those with a credit line. Labor is facing extinction through the violence of automation. The zero-sum game of outsourcing has nowhere left to go. While the political economy of the digital can more or less be named, and let's take one aspect of that, the FANG companies of Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and so forth, and its attendant cottage industries come to mind, the field of political media and cultural theory is still struggling to identify relevant modes of critique. How to transform the algorithmic architectures that extract value and determine the parameters within which subjectivity is now expected to subsist seems well beyond the capacities of critique as we know it. And perhaps, during this meeting, you've been able to work out, what some of those elements may be within the prevailing, conjuncture. Set against the backdrop of high-frequency trading, automation and robotics in manufacturing and service industries, and the computational processes developed with machine learning systems, the question of human agency, let alone intervention, is increasingly sidelined by the operational superiority of the machine. The topic of automation brings together questions of labour, the state, taxation regimes, and political calls for a universal basic income or social wage. A related issue concerns the potential volatility of geopolitics and the governance of populations when countries are confronted with mass unemployment stemming from the automation of work. One need only imagine what might happen in countries of surplus populations, such as China or India, when robotics replaces humans on the factory floors, to say nothing of the impact of automation in the financial service and data processing economies of these countries. Actually, it was just the other week in Singapore at the Asia Research Institute that we were having this discussion in relation to 3D printing, and the printing of Adidas shoes came up as an example, whereby the factories that were doing this type of work in China and Asia were now relocating to be more proximate to markets in Europe and North America. So this was an interesting rebalancing, tipping over of what had come to be known as kind of the outsourcing of, capital production. So that kind of economic logic is now shifting, actually, as a result of some of these developments that we've seen in technology. And so this is what I mean by, the spectre of surplus populations, right? And the implications for this at the level of governance, when humans have kind of got nothing left to do, except go to the beach or, put on some more sunscreen or something like that. So to suppose surplus populations as internally consistent unitary formations is also to succumb to the statistical imaginary that motivates governmental technologies. Populations, in other words, are also internally inconsistent and differentiated. I think this is one of the key things actually Lefebvre was striving to do, in these classic sort of books, right, on rhythm analysis, for instance. The extraction of value from data generated through our use of and encounter with a range of digital devices and software platforms has led some to ask whether we're facing a paradigm turn with the advent of digital infrastructures that make possible new modes of production, distribution, social organisation, economy and control. Certainly, in some ways, we can speak of a new paradigm insofar as there is a generalised sense in which automation eclipses the human. Yet a more globalised and historical perspective attentive to the variegated ways in which automation plays out in terms of surplus populations might point, for instance, to the continued entrenchment of earlier structural conditions that emerged during and after the period of colonial imperialism. This is something that Etienne Balibar and Emmanuel Wallerstein analysed in their classic study, Race, Nation, Class. And today, within the context of platform capitalism, race, class, and nation play strongly in the international division of informatic or informatized labour. And I'll just try and share this with you. Think, for example, of the concentration of Chinese gold farmers building in-game currency for time poor players in advanced economies to jump levels in massively multiplayer online games. Or consider the racialization of labour that defines the Indian body shopping networks that service the IT industries in Europe and North America with flexible labour management systems. Amazon's Mechanical Turk is another instance of crowdsourced microwork in which the human is a substitute for the machine. Whether the subjectivities produced through these categories of race, class and nation are ones around which political techniques of contestation are organised is another matter, however. Though we could note how the Turk-Opticon, as it's called, platform, has enabled AMT workers to organize politically. This takes us to a definition of platform, commonly understood as a social technical mode of organization. Platform capitalism signals modes of capital accumulation organized through social technical systems. Nick Schoenberg, as I mentioned, has recently published a bit of a landmark book on platform capitalism, where he critically synthesizes the various studies of sharing economy and the monopoly tendencies of platform capitalism. The monopoly of control for Schoenberg is distinct from the case of platform capitalism, which he considers as having problems in terms of reproducing itself. Here we can note Uber's dependency on venture capital welfare and struggle to generate revenues and profit, while advertising platforms such as Google and Facebook are hoarding their cash, centralizing their capacity through mergers and acquisitions, and investing in R&D and tech startups rather than fixed capital. Once the masses of users strapped to any particular form of platform take flight, there's nothing much left other than a tanking share price. The key asset of many platforms is data. And without the free labor that both generates a substantial portion of this central resource and often enough functions as a target market demographic, these digital infrastructures are left highly vulnerable. Although Schoenberg notes that such platforms also extract data from other sources, including economic transactions, information collected by sensors of the Internet of Things, corporate and government data, such as credit records and financial records, and public and private surveillance, such as the cars used to build up Google Maps. Another prevailing tendency within digital media critique assumes an evolutionary logic from the military-industrial, or what some term the military-digital complex, that conjoins technology to social control. The urban theorist Paul Virilio distilled this thesis most clearly in proposing the particular adoption of technology as instantiating a militarization of civil society. Of course, we can query such propositions. First, social control by technological apparatuses is not exclusive to the military-industrial complex. Feminism has showed us well how patriarchal power operates as an apparatus of social control. Althusser extended the idea of apparatuses of control as that which are multiplied across institutions of the state, while the Frankfurt School had their variant in an ideology critique of the cultural industry. These days, we can see modes of social control via digital technology that don't always have origins in the military-industrial complex. In any case, we'd be limiting our analysis and critique of automation and economy in supposing that a unilinear determining force stems from any single origin or actor. Having said that, the idea of technological devices that multiply the operation of control across the social body is one that seems reasonable enough to me and is evidenced in our daily lives by the extraction of value through the many real-time digital technologies we use or encounter in the sensor city on a daily basis. Indeed, our critique might benefit from identifying how the perpetual requirement of capital to forge new techniques that serve the reproduction of value has generated new forms of power that are distributed widely in different ways across the social political body. Interestingly, there is often enough a high degree of inoperability within platform capitalism. In other words, the various platform technologies that structure economy and life as we know it do not always work so well. The basic function of platform technologies is to facilitate the collection and sharing of data and interaction between users. But rarely do these platforms accommodate sharing across platforms. You either use Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, Amazon Web Services, or whatever, right? But you're not often shifting data or encountering social relations across these platforms. Service apps like Uber even patrol their workers to make sure they're not working for other companies' apps. And these platforms then are silos which operate through the principle of exclusion as distinct from transversality. And this is what contributes to the monopoly tendencies within platform capitalism, and perhaps even ultimately their demise. Whether we can organize in political ways as social networks independent of digital platforms is a vexed question. The Snowden revelations of the NSA surveillance apparatus was a clear prompt for many to review their digital communication practices. Encryption is relatively easy to set up for email, but it becomes more of a challenge for many modes of communication. One approach adopted by activists in Hong Kong's umbrella movement, which I'm sure many of you have been following closely over the years, was to engage communication platforms that work off the grid. The FireChat app made possible mesh networks that weren't dependent on activists being online. Communication and political organization instead happened over Bluetooth connections, which meant that data and information could be exchanged through decentralized networks without being subject to pattern inspection by the enemy due to the database empires in the form of storage facilities such as data centers. Those open, unsecured communication protocols, the Bluetooth model did of course leave activists exposed to anyone within range dropping in as infiltrators. Such decentralized practices also raise the question of collective archives as a technology for the future political organization, though I'm only flagging this for now. Decentralized communication practices and architectures are often not an option, and for this reason, along with the multiple hierarchies that comprise any mode of governance, whether these are symbolic, social, architectural, systems related or otherwise, it should be enough of a signal for political thought consider how centralized modes of governance and their attendant infrastructures might serve radical agendas. This doesn't mean jumping onto Facebook or Weibo to organize your next protest, so much as foraging among the infrastructural ruins of digital economy and society and inventing new grammars of expression and polity formation. Perhaps it is time then for activists and political theorists of digital media cultures to take seriously the constitutive work of centralized systems of organization and stop valorizing decentralized, distributed modes of communication and realize that these decentered modes are predicated on centralization. As we see in our collective research on data centers, a project that a number of us have been doing in Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, Chile. But don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating some Leninist revival celebration of the party political form here. That can be left to the good folks like Jody Dean, Badiou, Zizek, and their devotees. Prominent in many of the reports and academic studies on automation is an evacuation of labor from processes of capital accumulation and profit generation. While work as we understand it in both Fordist and post-Fordist eras of capital accumulation has become also something that is certainly more occasional and intermittent for many, precarity is the name by which much of this work goes by, there's also striking geopolitical and geocultural dimensions to this. Child labour and excessive hours experienced in many parts of the world remains exhausting and often unbearable for many, I'm sure. Within the advanced economies, it's clear that this is less the case over the past 30 years or so, where the conditions and experience of labour have become more intermittent and uncertain. It's hard to say conclusively what is in store for labour in the age of automation. Automation has been with us for more than a few centuries and defined the modern era of industrial production and manufacturing. Wage labour didn't end during these periods, but rather diversified and found new ways to subsist in a capitalist system under constant transformation and periodic crisis. Having said that, it seems that we are now entering a new period in which automation takes command. Personally, I find it hard at the current conjuncture to imagine how labour reinvents itself as digital modes of automation make redundant employment across many sectors in the economy. Drawing on the work of Italian political theorist Cristiano Marazzi, Sean Cubitt, in his new book on finite media, writes, and I quote him here, that the expropriation of the commons, whether environmental or intellectual, and the rents charged on the privatized results are the recourse of capital increasing returns when faced with the collapse of labour value in the declining manufacturing sector. Tiziana Terranova reiterates this point, noting that Italian and French economists such as Carlo Vecellone, Andrea Fumagalli, and Stefano Lucarelli have argued that an economy based on knowledge requires a new form of welfare, which is adequate to the new conditions, what they call common fare or welfare of the common. So it's within such a context and condition the idea of a universal basic income, social wage, or common fare has been gaining momentum across various political movements as well as the mainstream. For the most part, this has been a European debate. It would be interesting to hear whether this sort of theme, discussion, structural kind of system of economy has been something coming up in debates in China and elsewhere. For those affiliated with anarchist or leftist critiques of the state, an immediate conundrum is presented. Who is to administer and facilitate the collection of taxes required to fund something like a basic income for all, if not institutions of the state? And in an automated age of mass unemployment, how is the state or any other governing complex to derive revenue from a society without labour value? These are not questions suffered by those subject to the uneven distribution and treatment of toxic waste generated by economies of consumption. This was something I was studying, quite a bit with my students in Ningbo a number of years back, where we're looking at the electronic waste industries and the kind of remarkable, subaltern, if you like, or informal kind of intelligence around financial crisis that emerged, 2 years before the so-called event of the crisis. The automatic society does not result in a shortage of work for those delegated with cleaning up the mess. The extent to which a populist environmentalism is able to address the ethico-political question of redistribution across geopolitical and geocultural scales is reliant on collective practices of translation, not reducible to disciplinary policing, machine standards, or the logic of equivalence special to colonial imperial modernity. How to withstand the onslaught of extractivism that defines frontiers of contemporary capitalism is a struggle common to many. I'll close with 2 suggestions. The first and most obvious target to tax are the many corporations that roam across the planet enjoying a minimal or zero tax status. A bold government would be one that unleashes the tax collector on platform capitalism without fear of threats of investor withdrawal. But government on this scale is coincident with the state, and the state, as we know, is deeply enmeshed with the interests of the private sector. By the way, I'd really like to just emphasize that I'm not at all kind of thinking or proposing or assuming some static concept of the state here, but rather it's something that has multiple organized organs and has transformed in numerous ways over the last 30 years or so. The second option might consist of something like a micro-tax on automated high-frequency trading, which in 2010 accounted for around 50 to 70% of all global transactions, and by 2012 had skyrocketed to 84%, according to an analysis by Morgan Stanley. The complexity of derivatives trading and the difficulty in identifying originary financial institutions make accounting and regulation highly difficult. Even though the adoption across financial institutions of blockchain architectures is at this stage embryonic, the public ledger system that underpins blockchain might enable the auditing of cryptocurrencies for purposes of transactional taxation. I mean, we only need to see the sort of extraordinary wealth being generated out of Bitcoin at the moment, and indeed high volatility within China as people have shifted their money out of the real estate bubble and parked it in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, which of course are another bubble waiting to kind of collapse. The third option also presents itself. Common fare is universal basic income, self-organized without the state. And the dot-com bubble of 2000-2001 did spectacularly well at creating value literally out of thin air. So, why not a common fare that generates value not dependent on state-administered tax? Platform capitalism coincides with what I've elsewhere called the logistical state and what we might term now, the automated state. In a society of automation, we might also require an automated state able to operate in ways imminent with digital architectures of transaction and control. Putting aside the production of subjectivity and desire, whether a basic income for all is generated from a politics of distribution remains to be seen and is something to which we might turn our research attention. Thank you very much for your patience with all of this.
So we will, unlike other panels, since you're here with us, we will first raise some questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and we'll pass the mic around.
我的问题是，那如果这样来定义，重新定义国家和这个国族，还有这个资本，那么对于这个帝国 （empire） 的定义，那么像 Facebook、像 Google 都已经是可以算是一个 empire。那么在东方有像中国这样的严厉控制这个互联网空间的这样的一种政府的行为，那对于这帝国的定义，那是不是应该有新的一种定义方式，适合这个我们新的这个信息时代？谢谢。
So one question was asked right now by one of our speakers of this morning panel, and if I understood it right, it's now that we see the progress and the importance taken by major platforms such as Facebook or other spaces, what do we do with the notion of equal, of empire? So do we need a new definition of this empire and the kind of power it represents in this global automated era you're describing?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's hard not to, of course, since the book by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, think of the empire thesis they presented us with. Of course, at the time they wrote this in the 1990s, it was a different kind of period in history, and it's understandable that they were not giving attention in that particular book to the, if you like, kind of protocological regimes of governance and control that we've seen emerge in most amplified ways over the last decade. So I think the concept of empire is still a useful one to hold on to, but I think it can also now be kind of complemented by an attention and study, a critique of the type of computational architectures that govern the production of space, territoriality, subjectivity in labor and economy today. I think there's particular attention we can give, given that we're speaking here in the last 2 days on the work of Henri Lefebvre, is to the way in which new forms of territoriality are produced in ways that are imminent to the social technical architectures of platform capitalism. This is something that we can develop out of the concept of empire and the interest in immanence as a kind of mode in which power is modulated. But yeah, I think we now need to look at these architectures quite closely, because actually they're not global, they're not standardized, and we know there's enormous geocultural variation around the planet in terms of the type of architectures people engage with. And in so doing, different kind of variations, if you like, of capital accumulation are taking place.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
我非常同意那个 Rossiter 教授提的一些东西哦。那对我们来说特别深有感受的是，人文就最后在文档里头，我们要重新更新我们研究的观点嘛。但是现在人文社会科学其实对于技术资讯控制其实是非常的卑躬屈膝的。我的意思说，我们根本没有办法发言，我们没有办法拿回我们以前的那种力量。那我想要知道那个 Rossiter 怎么看，这是第一个问题。第二个问题是。
So this was a question from Professor Huang here. And the question is that now, since we're seeing the development, the power of those devices, we feel like as social sciences and as humanities, we have been taken away from our critical capacity to respond. So his first question is, how do you perceive our role when faced with the digital powers?
The second one.
Second question.
第二个问题有点复杂，就是说，因为这很像那个Benjamin Franklin 的那本书的 State， 他也那本书也重新定义了什么叫 State， 或者我们怎么思考区域跟国家的关系。那昨天还有今天下午5号中报告的那些东西，比如说淘宝跟东京都开始用无人的机器来进行物流。那么杭州这边开始有资讯资源局，也就是说资讯跟自然资源是一样的，可以管理的，可以控制的。那所以不止在整个 national state 上，也在各个地方 local state 上也开始掌握这些 information。那从无人机、无人分派的机器，一直到自动化、物流化的国家。那我在想说，那我们需要一个什么新的工具来？ 新的分析方法来面对这个事情，这跟第一个问题有点关系。
The second question is a bit more complex, and it's also a reference to the need to redefine the notion of state, and it's also a reference to the book of Benjamin Burton on state and hardware. I think the Professor Huang is mentioning the fact that, for instance, in Hangzhou we have Alibaba, we have also the main competitor of Alibaba, Dongjing. They are all approaching territoriality in a way that we could think that you could control the state and through apparatus like you would control nature. But it's about this new definition of space, and the question Professor Huang is asking, if I understood properly, is what kind of conceptual instruments, what kind of method of analysis, and especially your work is particularly relevant to this, that you can combine this new definition of the state with the new form of logistical powers that we are tending to.
Yeah, thanks. They're fantastic questions. So, to the first question, we've you can hear okay?
Yes, we can hear okay. Just
sorry. Yeah, to the first question, I think we seem to love crises, right? Of one kind or another. If it's not our own, then it's someone else's or it's the planet's. But with regard to your first question, one thing we have been presented with sounds okay? Yeah?
Yeah, sound is okay. We just
okay, no problem. Yeah, no problem. One thing we've been presented with, I think, is a crisis of disciplinarity. I've noticed this, particularly in my own field of media theory. We can no longer, at least in my field, enjoy the kind of monopoly of knowledge with regard to our object of research. What I mean by that is that media studies no longer has a monopoly on the media, on media technologies, computer science, the digital humanities, the health sciences, architecture, medicine, right? All of these disciplines now are dealing, of course, with the digital and computationality. So, if you like, the object of knowledge has escaped the kind of focus of research that media theory, media studies, communications once enjoyed. So actually, I found that a particularly helpful thing because what it has done has galvanized the question of what is distinct about media theory. Why do we even bother doing it? And I think what is distinct, and this goes for a number of disciplines, I think, across humanities and arts, is that we ask the question of power. Medicine doesn't ask this, nor does computational science, nor do the kind of health sciences, nor, unfortunately, do so many of our colleagues who have been embracing big data methods, and what we've seen quite perversely over the last 20 years, let's say, is an abandonment of the critical project that many of us were trained in and learned, throughout the kind of structuralist, post-structuralist debates. Instead, it's absolutely stunning in Australia the way this is adopted. We have rampant neo-positivism running across the humanities, and it has a deep epistemological failure to kind of critique the fact that there isn't correlationism at work between data and that which it supposedly refers to. Much of data is in fact self-referential. So this is the kind of condition that I think you identify. How to respond to that? Well, you know, I think then the invitation, and something we've certainly been doing across the Transit Labour and Logistical Worlds project and our new project on data centres, is to say we can only do collective transdisciplinary work. We can only understand a little bit of this. The temporality of our work in the university means that we don't have the luxury to go out in the field for 1 or 2 years like the anthropologists once did, unless you're coming out at one of the privileged Ivy League universities in the US or indeed perhaps China. And so we've also then been presented with the question of method, right, which you asked about, and what to do there. You know, I think the so-called black box that much algorithmic apparatuses present us with invite us to try out new things. So I'll just give a very fast example of that. Our study on data centers now is a classic study of black box technologies. You know, you might get an invitation into data centers, but what do you see? A bunch of server racks, security cameras, loud noise, and totally paranoid staff who show you around and won't say very much. You've seen one, you've kind of seen them all. There's not a lot of variation there at the level of infrastructure. But there's enormous variation, we think, in terms of experimenting with method, and this is where we really like to work with artists, designers and engineers. So what we're looking to do is, as a client, hire service space in Singapore, Hong Kong and Sydney, and do things like get a bunch of publicly available open data from climate scientists and throw it down the pipe and attach glow sticks and see where that data, what the network topology is, and then see where it starts to break down. And this raises the question you asked of territoriality. So the idea of the borders of the nation state being somehow, beyond time in a way, become redefined when we look at territoriality through infrastructure, like cables. And so our study of Singapore, for instance, may indeed take us out to Guam when we see that the switch points on Guam that route internet traffic around the planet are the point at which this data dump we've made breaks down. And so this then asks new questions of infrastructural sovereignty as well, contest state sovereignty.